Hi everyone, today we've created this conversation especially for SHAG Week to provide some further discussion about how to stay safe online. For anyone who doesn't know, SHAG Week, that stands for Sexual Health Awareness and Guidance, is happening now from the 14th to the 18th of February, and you can find out more about what's going on the USSU website. My name is Ami. I'm a part-time support zone officer, and I will be speaking with Dr. Emily Setty. Emily is a lecturer in criminology, but as well as this, specialises in topics such as sexual and digital culture and sexual consent, especially with young and young adults. While the support zone was deciding on topics to discuss during SHAG Week, digital safety and how to get the most of online sexual activity was one of the first areas we wanted to go out there for the Surrey community. So Emily, as our Surrey expert, was our first choice, and we're really, really glad to have her here with us today. So I'm now going to let Emily introduce herself before we jump into the other topics.
Thanks, Ami. And yeah, likewise, super excited to be here and honoured, of course, that you invited me on. And I think, yeah, you kind of pretty much covered it in what you've said. So I've been a lecturer here at Surrey for the last few years. I did my PhD here as well, also my undergraduate degree. So I clearly love Surrey. But yeah, so my PhD was investigating young people's involvement in what we called sexting at the time, even though I'm sure listeners are thinking, what a lame word. But basically the production and exchange of sexual content online, be it a message talking about sex, a picture of somebody nude, or a video of someone doing something or whatever. And as a criminologist, I was really interested in young people's perceptions and experiences of risk and harm when it comes to sharing this kind of sexual content. And since my PhD, I've done all sorts of research with young people and young adults to try to better understand the experience of sex and relationships, both online and offline, and how we can address some of the issues and challenges that unfold, particularly with some of the contemporary concerns that we'll be talking about today.
So our first topic of discussion for today is going to be digital safety. So could you please define digital safety when it comes to sex and relationships?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, based on the research that I've done, in this field, is that digital safety really needs to be understood in terms of sexual citizenship and ethical sexual cultures. So something that I find when I go and speak to young people and young adults is this idea that, you know, anything goes online. You need to expect the worst in terms of how you'll be treated. And the sensible thing to do is to not really participate in online sexual behavior of any kind, because you run the risk of being harmed by somebody, right? So low expectations almost. And for me, I think we really need to think critically about some of those assumptions and whether maybe we can reconceptualize digital safety when it comes to sex and relationships to be more about ethical behavior, right? Our responsibilities and obligations to treat one another with respect and decency, and also to recognize when we're not being treated properly, not to blame ourselves, as I'll talk about maybe later, but to get help with it and to support each other, right? So maybe it's helpful to talk a bit about how sexual relationships are kind of playing out online and some of the issues that might arise in terms of keeping ourselves safe. Yeah, sure. So obviously, like I say, my research is quite interested in how young people are participating in digital spaces to express themselves sexually, to share sexual content with each other, maybe messages, videos, pictures, that sort of thing, right? And often that can be seen as an unsafe thing to do by definition, right? But I think that might be a bit of a naive way of looking at it, because, you know, at the end of the day, these days, most parts of life and the way we live and interact with each other, a lot of it does happen online. So we shouldn't be massively surprised that people are exploring their sexuality, expressing themselves in this way digitally, right? If people are interested in physical sex, why would they not want to be doing things online as well? It's all part of the same kind of human way of relating to the world in 21st century society, right? That's not to say that everybody should be participating in this. That obviously I can say a bit more about it in a moment. But given the normalization of digital media in all of our lives, what you find, or what I've certainly found, and other people doing research in this field have found, is that there can be a lot of judgmental attitudes that prevent that kind of online sexual citizenship and digital sexual ethics from really being able to take hold. So let's say, for example, the obvious one, that if someone shares a nude image of themselves, and they choose to do that, let's say, and then it gets leaked, there can be a whole load of victim blaming that goes on. People are told, well, you know, if you didn't want your images leaked and you didn't want all this drama, then why did you do it to begin with? That was a really stupid thing for you to do. And yeah, it's so sort of reminiscent to me of like long-standing victim blaming that we much more readily call out, don't we? If a girl gets attacked and people turn around and say, oh, well, what were you wearing? And like, had you been drinking? Quite rightly now, we don't think that that's an acceptable way to respond. But with digital stuff, we do seem to still respond like that. We say, well, why did you get involved to begin with? Didn't you predict that something harmful would happen?
And I guess that also comes from what you were saying in the beginning, the people are kind of expecting the worst when it comes to online, and it shouldn't really be that way.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think a big part of that expectation is because people are focused on the affordances of technology, right? You know, the whole privacy is dead in the digital era type narrative. And yeah, absolutely. Technology does provide opportunities for abusive behaviors, right? If you get a picture of someone else, you do have this amazing tool that can enable you to distribute that and to make copies of it and all of that. So yeah, of course, the technology does exist, right? And we need to understand the impact of this. But we can't then say, oh, well, because of the technology, this stuff is inevitable, right? Because it's not. The technology is a tool, and individuals need to decide how to use that tool and make responsible decisions, right, within that context. And what's interesting to me, and we see this with sexual offending all of the time, we often talk about the agency and the responsibility of victims when something goes wrong. What could they have done differently? What we tend to focus on less is, well, what about the person that chose to engage in the harmful behavior? What about their agency? What about their responsibility to make a different choice? In the case of, say, distributing someone's nudes, the tech doesn't just pick itself up and do that. A person has to engage in that behavior, right? And we should be asking, why are they engaging in that behavior? And what is the consequence of that, both to the victim and the person who's actually doing the harm, right?
So,
you don't...
sorry. No, just finish what
No,
saying.
you go. Yeah, no, carry on.
In relation to this, what would be some red flags that you've seen in general, and when is something not okay? What should someone do if it happens to them or to someone that they know?
Yeah, so, you know, I think what we need to be aware of then is consent, okay? The very sort of fundamentals of what goes on online in terms of sexual behavior is that it should be consensual. And absolutely, if stuff is getting distributed and the person in the image does not consent to that, that is not a bit of gossip. That isn't, oh, look at what that victim's done, how shameful and embarrassing. It's, oh my goodness, something very seriously non-consensual has gone down here, right? And the problem is, because of all the shame and blame that is put onto victims of this, the person themselves who's affected by it can sometimes, you know, internalize that and not report it and not do anything about it, right? And then the reputational damage that then unfolds, because we often say, don't we, oh, it's really bad if your images gets out because people are going to judge and shame you. But actually, they don't have to judge and shame you. Just like that person that shared your image non-consensually, the people responding to it, all the bystanders, all the people that hear about it, don't actually have to turn on the victim. They can say, oh man, that's totally out of order and should never have happened. And we should be standing in solidarity with victims and not rewarding perpetrators for doing this stuff, right? And so, yeah, a red flag is consent, both in terms of how you're being treated, but also in terms of what you might see going on around you for your friends or whoever. Like I say, maybe technology is normalizing some of this stuff, but it doesn't mean that everyone's doing it or that everyone should be doing it. It's a personal choice. But just because you might say make a personal choice not to do something doesn't mean that you shouldn't stand in solidarity with people who did do it and then were treated really unethically. It should be like, yeah, it's not my bag, but you know, your privacy should have been respected. You know, it doesn't bother me if someone else sends a nude image of themselves. There's no
Exactly.
skin off my nose if they do that. Whether it's no impact on me. And why should I then join in spreading rumors, gossip, whatever, right? And the thing is that requires ethical behavior, and sometimes that's really difficult to do. So like I remember once in personal life, my friend, we were all out or whatever, and she's dating this guy, and she's like, oh my God, I've got a picture of him. Do you want to see it? And she's getting it up, and everyone's reacting, oh yeah, cool. And you think, wow, guys, like, we need to pause here, right? This is someone we don't know who's sent this picture expecting a level of privacy. Do we really think this is okay to just be sharing it around?
And
Like,
people really be seeing this.
exactly. And like, obviously I had all this in mind because I was doing my like PhD on this very topic at the time it was happening. But it's not about turning around. Calling people out is a really unfortunate sort of expression in some senses, because it seems so divisive. It seems like it's just going to trigger an argument, and people just kind of position themselves morally and think they're better than other people and call someone out, and then they get called out, and it's all just deteriorates. I don't actually think that's the solution in these scenarios. Like, these are our friends potentially. We don't want to be engaging in this kind of stuff, but we just need to react differently and change the culture and say, oh wow, cool, like, you've got a picture of them, that sounds exciting, but like, keep it to yourself, and laugh it off. You don't have to make it serious. Talk to them about how they feel, their relationship with that person, like, go for it, but while respecting the privacy of the person in the image. And the slow changes to the culture that we can all make is a really important part of keeping each other safe, of keeping ourselves safe. And on this point about red flags, like I say, consent is a massively important aspect of this. And it's not just what happens to the image after it's been produced. Like I was saying, everyone has the right to decide whether they want to participate in this or not. And all choices are valid. And we shouldn't feel under pressure to do something that we're uncomfortable with, or maybe, as I think often happens in sex and relationships, that we're not sure about. Often consent is this thing of, do you consent or do you not consent? Yes or no. But actually our feelings about it can be a lot more complicated than that. And people I speak to will be like, oh, I'm not really sure about this whole thing about sending nudes, but I know that like the person might want it and I kind of want to make them happy. So I'm not really sure what to do. And sometimes the person who wants it might be pressuring them and actively saying, like, I want this, and not really taking no for an answer. So this kind of pressure can work in lots of different ways. And I think we do have to be honest and talk a little bit about the gender dynamic that plays a role in some of this stuff. Yeah, absolutely. These relationships, it can be same-sex relationships, heterosexual couples, young people, young adults of men, women, and all other genders can be involved and affected by this stuff positively and negatively. But we do know that the pressure on girls and women can be higher, and they can be more aware, say, of pleasing their partner when they're in a heterosexual relationship, and they can feel quite obligated to that. And also then they're in a double bind, because we do find that women tend to be shamed more for doing this stuff. So they feel under pressure to do it, and then they get the shame if it gets leaked and they get found out, right? And I think that's almost a red flag in some respects. Like, we've got to consider the stereotypes, the gender norms, the assumptions and the expectations that people are bringing to these experiences online, right? And that's actually for yourself to understand, am I coming under pressure? It's also for bystanders to figure out, right, am I just shaming someone because they're a woman? Or am I shaming a guy because I think he looks a bit desperate and creepy or whatever? What am I actually responding to here? Is it the ethics of the behavior, or is it just my judgment of the person? Because we know a lot of that is tied up in all those ideas about gender and sexuality that can be so kind of prejudice and unfair on people. And also, though, the person who kind of initiates it and feels up for it and wants to consent to it. Okay, let's say stereotypically it's the guy who thinks this is all just a bit of fun and wants pictures of girls or whatever. Yeah, they're not sort of worried about their own consent, but what expectations are they putting on the person, right? And what are they sort of implicitly, maybe without even realizing? Should we be aware of, like, does this person really want to do this? Do they just feel a bit obligated to me? And maybe do I need to take the brakes off and try to, or put the brakes on, as it were, and see whether there's a way of negotiating this in a fairer way. And that is also really important, not just for asking for this stuff, it's also for sending it. I'm sure many listeners and watchers of this, female perhaps more likely, will be familiar with the idea of being sent unwanted sexually explicit content, sometimes on a very regular basis. And this is something that I'm speaking to teenage girls at a really young age, and it is rife, right? And not very pleasant. That's not to say all of them are experiencing it. Some of them turn around and are like, I've never been sent one. What does that mean if it's so normal?
Really good you haven't.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that, the whole phenomenon of that, is that you find that women can sort of blame themselves no matter what. If they're not getting sent it, they're like, oh, am I not desirable? Does no one kind of want this? And then if they are sent it, they're like, oh God, have I got a reputation? Does someone think I want this? Does someone think I'm that kind of girl? So the shame and the self-blame that is wrapped up in all of this is so pervasive. And actually, women don't need to do much to feel ashamed and to feel that they're doing something wrong. And we really need to start disrupting some of that. And it starts with recognizing that as a really serious form of harassment. This isn't just a joke. Some men and boys that I speak to about sending like dick pics or whatever we want to call them will say, oh, well, it's just like a way of sort of shocking somebody. It's no big deal. And it's almost constructed as an initiation. So you just send one out, most of the women are going to ignore you, but maybe one will come back and be into it. And so to them, they almost don't need consent to send the picture. Sending the picture is the initiation, and then the person either consents to carry it on or doesn't, right?
Really interesting, actually. Yeah, if they take your response as you giving consent or not, rather than asking if you want that.
Exactly. Like it is, but it's harassment in much the same way as just flashing someone in the street would be harassment, right? It's digital flashing, and we need to frame it as such. And we need to move away from this idea that girls and women should just accept it as part and parcel of being online, right? Oh yeah. The teenage girls I speak to about this say, if you want to be on Snapchat, if you want to be on Instagram, you just got to take the rough with the smooth. It's just part and parcel of life. And really, are we comfortable with that? If we were saying to walk down the street, you just have to accept people flashing their penises at you, you probably think society's gone a bit wrong somewhere, that we need to resolve this. Just like actually a lot of the recent conversations about sexual harassment, sexual violence and all of that is about women's rights to exist in public space without having to put up with being harassed. And we hold that up. That's our standard for physical real life, even though it's still debated and people still have different opinions about it.
The same for online life.
Exactly. We should have exactly the same conversation about online life, just because, as I was saying earlier, we've got these amazing digital tools these days that can potentially be used to harmful effect doesn't mean that they should be. And if we think that something would be wrong offline, then it should be wrong online. And we should be holding people responsible for that. And we should be getting people to aspire to decent standards of behavior, particularly, adults, right, legally sharing someone's images without consent, sending images that they don't want to ask for. These are harassing, illegal behaviors now, okay? And we need to recognize them as such. And we need to be preparing young people to see them as such. We need to be talking to kids in school about this being abuse and about it being wrong, and not that, if they're a victim of it, you aren't to blame. You can resolve it, and giving people avenues in order to resolve it. Because at the moment, all the blame and all the shame and all this, oh God, what are the young people of today doing online? And it all just gets a bit trivialized in those sorts of narratives. But actually, we do need to take it seriously. And those, therefore, are ultimately the red flags. It is about consent. And it's about rights and respect. And, and that in those scenarios, if we start becoming aware of this, then this is where digital technology can be amazing. Like, I want to be sex positive about it. I want people to believe that, this isn't just all about being safe and avoiding harm. We can actually have a really great time, but that good time should be based on consent. It shouldn't be based on one person feeling they've got to do something, one person having fun at someone else's expense. Because let's be honest, looking at someone's nudes without consent can be really fun for the people looking at them. My friend that wanted to show it to us, yeah, great for a group of girls to perv over an image of a boy they don't know. Yeah, fine. But that's your fun at the expense of someone else's rights and privacy. And that is just not okay.
That is happening anyway, because most of the times the other person is not even aware that obviously all of this is out there for everyone to see.
Exactly. We need to be much more empathetic. And I think that's where challenging some of those victim blaming narratives is really helpful, because this idea of, well, it's a bit stupid to share a nude, so if you do, you kind of like deserve the consequences almost, or at least you're responsible for the consequences. That can really underpin then a lack of thought to that victim and to that person when people are making decisions. Because if we just think these people are stupid, we don't feel guilty about harming them. We're not thinking about the impact on them or how it might be making them feel. And this is the thing, around sort of gender dynamics and power dynamics within sexual relationships, we need to be thinking about who matters within a dynamic and whose feelings are important, and if we can start actually having a more mutual understanding of that. And that's about, we know heterosexual dynamics can sometimes involve power that falls in this unequal way on men and women. And there can be this idea of like, oh, women, they're not really sexual. They want a relationship. They care about emotion. Like the guy's pleasure is what matters. And even the way sex is set up, it's about like men and their pleasure, right? Like, and women are kind of secondary often to that. And actually I had an interesting conversation once with a teenage girl who was sharing nudes, and I was asking her, like, why are you doing it? And she was saying that she thinks it's really fun. And I was like, okay, what do you think is fun about it? And she said, oh, it's just so good. Like you turn on the guy and like he really fancies you and you feel like, wow, I've managed to turn him on. And I was like, okay, what about your pleasure? Like, do you get turned on? Like, how do you feel? And she goes, oh, I don't really feel anything, to be honest. Like, I don't really think girls get off on this kind of stuff. The excitement is pleasing the guy. And I was like, wow, okay. There's nothing wrong with wanting to please each other. But when it's set up in that gender dynamic, what role then does consent play in that process, and mutual consent play, where how both people feel matters? If we have this narrative that men's pleasure is sort of over and above women's, we're then going into a scenario where women are going to feel obligated and they're going to think that what they think and feel is secondary. And that's why I think we do need to change the narratives around consent. Same deal with sending dick pics or whatever. If the idea is the guy is saying, oh, I want to do this, I want to initiate, it's a very self-focused way of looking at it. And actually we should be looking at, well, what does the other person want, right? Consent shouldn't be a tick box. Oh, right, yes, I think we're all right with this. I think I've got enough to indicate that the person is okay with what's happening. It should be based on genuine care for that person. And that's whether you met them 5 minutes ago in a bar or whether you've been in a relationship with them for years. I'm not normalizing about what is a good relationship or what isn't. Have sex whenever, wherever you like. It doesn't bother me. But it should be about genuinely caring about the person. And if you do, if all of your actions were about genuinely caring for the person, a lot of the problems that we've just spoken about will go away.
Yeah, that would be a thing. Yeah. So how can students make the most out of creating or developing relationships online?
Yeah, it's all about being ethical and responsible. Of course, you can put in safe sexting techniques, that's what they call them, around, keep your face out of it, keep identifying features out of it, be careful about who you send it to, blah, blah, blah. But all of that is predicated on the idea of harm avoidance, that somebody is going to engage in harmful behavior towards you. And actually really having freedom to engage in happy and healthy relationships online really requires us all to commit to a more ethical outlook, right? And a more responsible outlook. Nude images aren't trophies or currency in relationships. They're really intimate and important to people, and that needs to be respected and explored, right? And I think we can like embody all of that in a positive vision. So not constantly warning people, oh, it can go catastrophically wrong, this is all completely dreadful. Actually, we can say it's your body, it's your choice. If you want to do this stuff, then fine, but make sure you do it ethically, based on consent, that consent is respected, in, you know, that both sides are respected and it's mutual, right? And even if the relationship ends, if something goes wrong, privacy and consent are like central to it. But in that sense, it's about bystander behavior as well, because it's not just about the two people that might want to have the relationship online. It's also about how other people respond to that. Even if you don't want to ever engage in this stuff, which is fine, you've got to uphold decent standards of behavior in others, right? And have those positive expectations of each other. So like I was saying, if your friend wants to show you a nude of someone else, yeah, say you're not down for looking at that. It's not okay. That's your role in being able to contribute to that healthier and happier kind of online space, and not judging and blaming victims and people who get involved, right? And actually aligning ourselves with what we think is right. Sometimes there's this idea of like, but the world isn't fair. So, you know, we might think something is right. We might take issue with something, but come on, the world isn't fair. But the world has always been unfair in various ways, and people create social and cultural change, right? Think about homophobia in society, right? I'm not saying it's over, far from it. Plenty of issues still around homophobia and judgment of people for their sexuality and their choices. But think about what it was like 20, 30 years ago, right? Much more of a potentially a more serious and more threatening environment, right? But it changed, and change is continuing to happen, and people are carrying on fighting for that. And the only way that change happens is if we see it as possible, and we don't just shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, you know, boys will be boys. We can't do anything about this. You know, girls just need to get smarter and etc. No, we need to have a more positive vision for change. And that will benefit all of us, right? It will benefit the people that want to be doing this stuff, but it will also benefit the rest of us, because we'll be living in a more equal, more ethical, more happier culture, right?
Our next topic of discussion is going to be porn, and same as before in this whole digital era kind of thing. When is porn good and when is it bad? And if there's any stats on how young people, whether it's teenagers or university students, use porn?
Yeah, cool. So that's a massive question. And not to be too academic about these things, and I will try to take my sort of lecturer hat off in these regards. But really, it depends on what we're even saying, meaning when we say pornography or porn or whatever we want to call it, because it is a bit of a rabbit hole. I'm actually currently supervising this really awesome PhD student who's looking at how young women relate to pornography and their perspectives on it. And it's actually quite challenging to pin down exactly what we mean by porn. But if we kind of put to one side all the sort of theoretical and conceptual debates about how to define it, and we go with the idea that one way or the other, porn is sexually explicit material produced with the intent of arousing somebody, then on the face of it, there's nothing inherently bad about it, right? It's pretty natural to want to be aroused and to want to use stimulation, you know, visual material, written material in order to do so, right? So it could be something from a commercial porn video that you see on Pornhub or wherever you go, or it could be an image on a billboard, right? Something you see in advertising, something you read in a book, right? We all know 50 Shades of Grey, don't we? Exploding onto the scene and shaking up the whole landscape of this kind of thing. Music videos, whatever it might be, right? The stuff we see in society that is sexually explicit and either directly or indirectly intends to arouse the people that are viewing it. Because yeah, you could say a music video, a billboard that's advertising something isn't directly about arousal, but it is indirectly wanting to arouse people in order to get them to engage with that material. So, you know, all these things work in really complicated ways. And we do then need to think about that if we're thinking about what impacts does it have on people. And in that sense, we should probably think about porn like we would any other media, right? What are we watching or reading, encountering of some kind, and how is it making us feel? And what are we then doing kind of as a result of what we're learning, what we're experiencing, right? We know that porn can be great on an individual level for couples, people in relationships who want to explore their sexuality, who want to get in touch with all of that, right? It can help people understand like what turns you on, what you're into. It can offer a release of sexual tension and build up and all of those feelings. Perfectly natural human stuff here. We need that in life sometimes, right? As with the whole nude image sharing, maybe you don't. Maybe this is the last thing you want to be engaging with, which is cool. But the benefits of doing so for the people that experience it in a positive way, are there, and it's a real sort of positive way of exploring and expressing yourself if that works for you. But we do need to think critically about this stuff because, I mean, I'm not one for overstating the impact of porn, right? Okay, yeah, undeniably there is violent and degrading stuff out there. You can go down real sort of dark paths, can't you, on what exists online and all the rest of it. And that definitely exists, and we need to like think critically about it. But that's not the same as saying, oh God, porn is the most evil thing that exists at the moment. It's so harmful for sexual behaviours. All these men are going out and behaving in really violent and abusive ways because of porn. I think there is a bit of a moral panic around some of that, right? What you tend to find statistically, at least, and the studies they're complicated to interpret, and there have been lots of attempts to try to understand what's really going on here and the chain of cause and effect with the correlations, because you do see, heavy viewing of pornography, particularly the more extreme stuff, can be associated with sexist ideas and certain assumptions about sexual behavior and so on. But yeah, the cause and effect is hard to pin down because people exist before the porn, right? What you're attracted to is a bit a reflection of who you are. So, the whole thing kind of works in symbiosis. And in that sense, porn is part of the tapestry of ways in which people learn about sex and relationships and relate to their body and relate to other people's bodies and develop those expectations, right? It's a significant part of that landscape. And we should be aware of what it's setting up and what it's normalizing. But we totally need to look at it from the perspective of the individual and what's going on in that person's life and the other things they're engaging with, right? I mean, we see sex and gender and relationships portrayed in all kinds of media to positive and negative effect, right? Porn is just another way of that. I mean, what do we think about reality dating shows for what they set up about the physical human body, about the meaning of relationships, about what sex is really all about? Probably not exactly realistic or what we can emulate, but it normalizes certain ideas, and porn is just another way in which that happens, right? And often, actually, whether you're talking about reality TV, porn, whatever you're talking about, and some people would say some of the reality TV stuff is actually porn, but often a narrative comes out that the key is distinguishing reality from fantasy and keeping the fantasy in its box and making sure, kind of like renewed image sharing, that what you actually then go out and do in your own sex life is consensual and respectful and mutual and all that kind of thing. And that we don't make assumptions about what people should look like, how they should behave or whatever from porn. And in a way, that's not complicated to grasp, is it? That's quite like it shouldn't be complicated, but sex and relationships are complicated, and the way in which we form our assumptions and our expectations, sometimes we don't even realize. And, but I think we do need to be mindful. We need to be mindful viewers in exactly the same way as nude image sharing. We need to understand, what are we getting out of this situation and what decisions are we making in this context, and thinking about that. Not saying, right, never watch porn, it's awful, it's terrible, it's going to damage you and turn you into a rapist. No, it's saying, okay, how can we engage with this in a way that works for us, becoming mindful and aware of the impact it's having on us, how it's making us feel. Something I talk to teenage boys about, they say, on the one hand, like, it is a fantasy and they like it and it's all exciting at the time, and then afterwards they just feel a bit gross about themselves because of what they've just watched, and they're like, oh, is it a bit weird that I'm getting off on this? And I'm like, look, this is good that you're thinking mindfully, that you're thinking critically, right? It's not about feeling ashamed of yourself or feeling that you've done something wrong. At the end of the day, commercial porn is very well designed by like $1 billion industry. They know exactly what to do to draw you in. The industry is massively exploitative. You as an individual consumer are not responsible for all the mess that exists out there online. but be aware of how it's making you feel. If you know, yeah, I watched it at the time, it's kind of cool, but then afterwards I feel a bit weird about myself, remember that and use that to make informed decisions next time about what you want to do. And definitely then reflect on that in terms of what you can expect when you go out into the real world. And it's not just about what boys and men expect. It's also about how girls and women feel about this kind of stuff as well, and the pressures on what you should look like and how you should behave. And that's where actually resolving some of this stuff, it does go back to mutual consent and respect having to be the hallmark of relationships, because if it is, then you can work through some of those dilemmas together. It's not wrong to say, I've seen something on porn and I'd kind of like to try it because it looks really cool. It's not actually bad to say that. I'm not here to say that some sex acts are bad and some are good, and porn shows us bad ones that we should never copy. Copy what you like, but make sure that it's based on mutual care and respect, and it's negotiated with that person. And it's not just about like, oh, I want to do something because I've seen it and that would make me feel good, or I think I've got to do this to please someone else. Actually use it as an ability to have a conversation. I actually think the saddest thing in society about porn is all the shame and stigma that goes on around it that prevents us from being able to speak openly and honestly about it. Teenagers are constantly telling me, we are told all the time that porn is bad, it's unrealistic, we shouldn't copy it, etc. And then they say, but no one tells us what's good about sex.
Yeah, what should we be?
Exactly. How do we want to be sexually then? What are good ways of engaging in sexual interaction? Okay, if porn is unrealistic about, I don't know, we know it edits out all the preparation that's required to engage in different sexual practices. Female pleasure is often completely distorted and it does not look like that in real life. And we tell kids all of that, but then we don't tell them what sexual pleasure does look like. We don't tell them how to prepare for anal sex. We don't give them any of that knowledge. We just tell them that porn is awful. And then we wonder why people are struggling to pin down, well, what am I learning from this? What should I be doing in my life? And yeah, we're all, we're talking about university age students now, where we can start having experiences of sex and start exploring some of that. But we've got the residue of that whole kind of experience of sex education where porn has potentially played a role. And if we can, like I say, go back to that idea of when you're in sexual environments with people and you're having sexual encounters, if you can have mutually beneficial, respectful conversations about what you want and what you don't want, then that can be a way of resolving some of these issues.
That is so interesting. I'll cut this one out, but that is so interesting. I wasn't sure what Charlotte meant by any stats on how young people use porn. Do you have any research that you want to share? Do you think that's relevant? If it is, ask the question again.
Yeah, I mean, you can. I could say some things about it, and you can cut whatever you want from it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So on a more research-based level, do you have any stats on how young people use porn that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying before, the studies on this have been quite difficult to interpret in some levels, but we know that in the end, a majority of young people are going to be engaging with this stuff one way or the other. And they vary as to how deliberatively they do that. Sometimes it's accidental, and sometimes it's sought out and enjoyed. And people are affected differently. Some come across porn and they're like, oh my God, no, and then they don't re-engage with it. Others become really regular viewers. We do see a gender split, that men and boys are much more likely to regularly watch porn, to say they enjoy it. For girls and women, they can be more reluctant. There's this idea that porn isn't for women. It's not emotional. It's not about relationships. It's brutal. It's this, it's that. Again, those gender stereotypes can kind of come out about what men and women want. And that can create pressures on and stigmas on both sides, actually. And I think what's interesting, though, with the statistics is looking beyond just the headline kind of numbers and correlations, because as I was saying at the beginning, porn takes on various forms and definitions. If you say to someone, have you ever watched porn? and you get a yes or a no, it's not particularly helpful. I mean, everyone focuses, don't they, on the really like problematic porn that's violent and degrading or whatever, but we know there's all kinds of porn out there. There's feminist porn that's trying to set up something different. Obviously there's all the erotica, all the books and the novels and everything. There's also, interestingly, something that comes out quite often is that women are quite into watching porn featuring gay men, and that's actually about sort of just the nature of what they're watching. Can actually be quite, they're not, they're not, it's quite hard to explain. It's not that they are actually aroused by what the two guys are doing, because obviously they can't participate in that, it's gay men, but the whole portrayal of sex is something that women can kind of connect with. And maybe because it is starting to diminish some of those gender dynamics where, male female porn is so out of sync, isn't it? It's like from the perspective of men, and women take this really subordinated role. Whereas I think the equality and mutuality that can unfold in gay porn, if we want to call it that, can be quite appealing to some women, right? Whereas gay porn involving two women can be experienced as quite alienating, because it is designed to arouse men who want to watch two women. It's not actually about women, enjoying that. So the thing is with all of this, and that only just skims the surface of the complexity of some of this stuff, of how people relate to it, but it really shows that it is complicated, right? And we know that people are affected even if they're not directly watching this stuff on an individual level. Maybe you've never watched porn, but the conventions of pornography might come into your life and into your relationship, and you may feel aware of it. Lots of women I speak to talk about their partner's porn habits and how that makes them feel, right? And there are a lot of narratives mixed up in that. Women feel like it's a betrayal, like their partner prefers porn to them. Again, it's that whole thing coming out of women have to please their partner and have to be this big sexual person for them to make them happy. And if they don't, then they might go and seek that out from porn, and it's almost like an affair. And so, yeah, those sort of heteronormative dynamics are quite powerful. But likewise, people can watch it together in relationships, and that can be a good or a bad thing. It can be great if it's done consensually and it's a way of exploring and talking about things. It can be a really great resource for doing that. But obviously, it's really problematic if one person in the dynamic doesn't actually want to be watching this and feels under pressure. So it really depends on the context. And so that's why statistics are always interesting, aren't they? We want to know the numbers of things, but they kind of raise as many questions as they answer in some regards. For me, it's about how are people feeling about what they're experiencing here? How does it fit with the rest of their lives,
That makes sense. So would you have any tips on how to use porn positively, whether we're talking alone or within a relationship? You've obviously mentioned it a little bit now, but do you have any tips?
Yeah, so, I think just like with nude image sharing, it's got to come down to consent. Okay, whether you're watching it by yourself, whether you're watching it with a partner, you've got to make sure that everyone's on board and is feeling happy. And when I say consent, I mean that we really endorse what we're doing. It goes back to that idea of like, we might be aroused by things that then make us feel a little bit uncomfortable later on, maybe. Or maybe we're kind of engaging with stuff and we're feeling a bit out of control. How videos and content online these days is organized to just make you just keep watching and going down and down and getting, compulsively into it. And so when I say consent, I mean really being mindfully aware of what it is you're engaging with, how it's making you feel, and whether you really endorse overall what it is you're experiencing and doing, and being really aware of any uncomfortable feelings that you're getting and all the rest of it. And likewise, then looking beyond actually the scenario in which you're like engaging with the porn, then right, how are you then taking it back into your life, right? I mean, I find it crazy really that we even talk about the notion of learning something from porn. I mean, we wouldn't say you need to learn how to drive, right, put on Fast and Furious, would you? And in much the same way that Fast and Furious is great because you can watch a car chase and it's really exciting. You're like, oh my God, I'd love to actually be able to do that. But we all know we can't, right? We can
do it, yeah.
Exactly. And I think the same goes with porn. If you're enjoying it and you're endorsing it, what you're doing, and you're feeling positive about it, then, great, enjoy it, and then figure out, right, but what relationship does this then have with the rest of my life? What is my expectation of the people around me, of myself? What do I think I have to perform like and look like? I know a lot of boys I speak to, compare themselves to the average male porn actor and are not feeling, like they're going to be able to emulate what they see. And in that sense, I think we do need to be mindful of the industry if we're going to use this stuff positively. Now, people often say that the porn industry is really exploitative, particularly like Pornhub and those kind of things, right? Where there is a lot of money involved. And it's true, the business model, you got, porn actors queuing up outside the door, being bussed in to do things. And if somebody doesn't want to do something, they can just be binned off and the next person can come and do it. It does set up, a lot of precarity for the people working in the industry, painful and unpleasant experiences. There have been documentaries on that kind of thing where porn actors actually speak to the nature of the industry and their experiences within it. Now, I think we should be mindful of that, and that should form part of our decision making. Sometimes what we watch in porn will look like a very violent rape, ultimately. And that might sometimes be because it is, because what is actually happening and what was filmed was not consensual. And there was pain and there was a lot of bad stuff that went down. And we're not responsible for that. We didn't film it. We didn't do it. We don't need to feel guilty about it, but we do need to be aware of that when we're deciding the kind of porn we want to engage with. We hear a lot these days about ethical consumption, don't we? And we care about businesses and what they're doing around the world and how they're treating their staff and the environment and veganism and all of this stuff that we're all thinking about more and more. And I'm not saying what your value system should be on that and whether or not we can really expect private commercial businesses to be saints over everything they do. There are a lot of debates around this kind of thing, but we do need to be mindful of it. And just like creating an ethical sexual culture when it comes to sharing nude images and really basing our judgments not on blaming somebody or whatever, but really actually saying, what do we think is right and fair? I think we as consumers can do that with porn. We can say, okay, what do I actually think is all right? What do I think is legitimate ethical porn? And actually, put my money where my mouth is. I know most of it's free, but the figuratively put your money where your mouth is and actually say, I'm going to engage in the stuff that makes me feel good, that I think actually represents something decent. And it's going to be unrealistic because, not being funny, but if you put a camera in the average sexual situation between people and filmed it, I mean, sex doesn't look like that in real life, does it? Things go wrong. I don't know. People make a funny noise. They fall off the bed. Something weird happens. Or, it's not the, and bodies aren't completely perfect all of the time. And it's not edited. So, I'm not saying that we want this realistic depiction of sex where we see all the stuff that happens before, all the negotiations of consent and all the emotional stuff. No, maybe not. I get it that it's going to be a fantasy. Don't want to pour cold water on it. But we can move within the confines of a fantasy towards that ethical, decent end, right? I sometimes think it's funny when teachers and stuff will talk about porn and they'll be like, porn just isn't teaching young people anything about consent. And I was like, but would they watch it if it did? Exactly. Like if porn was a lesson in how to put a condom on and how to make sure that someone's definitely comfortable with what's going on, you wouldn't, it's not fancy. No one's going to get aroused by that. It's not meaningful, right? So I don't think we should expect too much from porn. We should see it as a fantasy. We should see it as a way to, express our sexual feelings, to explore what we're into. But then we should say, but hang on, are we okay with the depiction here, right? Are we okay with maybe what sits behind the scenes here? And what are our fantasies? What are we being aroused by? And if we can do both, we need to reduce the salience of porn. We need to stop thinking about it as this huge significant thing that has a direct impact on people in this really negative way. But at the same time, we need to become more mindful of the choices that we can make, within it, because it's great that this stuff is available and we should be sex positive about it, I believe. I don't think the industry has to be exploitative. I don't think it all has to be violent and degrading, and it isn't. But it's up to us as consumers to seek out that stuff because there's such a diversity of porn. It's not all just, I don't know, incest porn on Pornhub. It really isn't. There is a lot out there to choose from that we can engage with that can make us feel good, right?
So we're approaching the end of this. So if you have any closing remarks or any final things that maybe I haven't asked and you want to briefly mention.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, we've covered so much, haven't we? And I'm sure people are done with with me talking about all this stuff. But I guess I suppose what kind of ties all this together is online sexual life, isn't it? Really, it's about self-knowledge and ethical and respectful orientations to this. We need to know about ourselves and what we think is right, what works for us, and we need to seek that out and be empowered to ask for that and have it respected, and that we deserve that. But then also that we're ethical and respectful toward one another as well. Because I really do believe that digital technology is amazing. It can really help us explore and express ourselves, our sexuality, our relationships, all of these things. It can be done in really exciting new ways. We don't have to, though, and we don't have to use technology to do that. It is a choice. But if we want to do it, then we really have to start being open to understanding ourselves and the person or the people, as it may be, that we're doing it with. It's about emotional intelligence. It's about responsibility and maturity, right? And we have a responsibility to do that, right? If we want to participate in sexual behavior, then we need to make sure that we have the capabilities and the outlooks and the attributes in order to do that in a way that will work for us and work for other people. We do have to think about it. We do have to be careful. We do have to be mindful and respectful. Sometimes you hear, don't you, these days, oh God, men, it's such a nightmare for them. They can't just go up and talk to women. They'll all be seen as harassment, and they'll just be, if they're in a sexual scenario, then there'll be accusations of sexual assault and blah, blah, blah. And I think, well, come on, actually, what's wrong with being careful? What is wrong with being respectful? And thinking, oh, hang on, I actually quite fancy that person over there, but I don't know whether they fancy me back. So I'm not just going to holler out over to them or storm straight up to them and start saying that they've got to take an interest in me. I'm actually going to be a bit careful, and I'm going to get to know them. I'm going to read the room a bit, and I'm going to look at their body language. What's wrong with doing that? And if we can both do it, not both, if all people can do it for each other, then that can create a much better culture. And likewise,
so many problems.
It would, if we just learn how to care about each other more and actually feel a little bit less entitled on the one hand, and then a little bit less obligated on the other hand, we might start to resolve some of this stuff. And maybe people will be listening to this thinking, oh God, that all just sounds a bit dull. Where's the excitement? You can have all the excitement. You can have the crazy rough sex. You can do all the really, the stuff you see on porn if you really want, but make sure it's based on mutual respect and consent, right? That's all that people are asking for. Not that you're entitled to anything, not that you can demand things, not that you've got to do things that you don't really want to do, right? And if we can remember that, then we can have loads of fun, and we can probably do more actually, because we're basing it on conversations and we're finding out new things about what we like, about what the other person likes. So the opportunities it opens up are so much more significant. So for me, it is about that real kind of positive vision. And maybe you have to be really careful in the beginning. The first time you send a nude, the first time you talk to your partner about something you've seen on porn that you want to try out, yeah, you probably got to be pretty sensitive and pretty careful to make sure they're definitely on board. And then the more you practice it, the more intimate you get with somebody, yeah, you probably don't need to worry so much. So it's just about building relationships. That's what it's about. Imagine stripping the technology out and then think, well, what relationships do we want to build? And what experiences do we want to have with one another? And yeah, that manifests online as offline. So that's what I would say. That's what my vision is. And maybe I'm being utopic.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this.